In fact, it's a little bit of an interesting story or anecdote to that is that it was sort of more on the mutual fund side. And then I was aware of the Millennium Bullion Fund run out of Canada. And that being listed as a mutual fund and normally should be investable by the wider public. I looked into that, and there were all sorts of restrictions, limitations, and when I telling some of the people that should list the funds and make it available, I said, this would be great for clients, for investors, and they said, oh, too risky, too concentrated. And I remember thinking, this is ridiculous. People can choose allocations. They can make small allocations to something that is very specific. And there's no reason why they shouldn't have exposure to this. And that sort of triggered a lot of questions in my mind about how precious metals were limited in terms of investment options for the average investor. And that, I guess, sort of led me to looking more and more into the space. And
Hey everybody, this is Rob Keens with GoldSilverPros.com. We're recording this on May 2nd, 2022, first video of the week. And we're here with a new guest, Peter Krauth, who writes for Silver Stock Investor, Gold Resource Investor, is a former portfolio advisor and 20-year veteran of the resource market, and has just written a book called The Great Silver Bull, Crush Inflation and Profit as the Dollar Dies. We're here to interview him to get his views on silver, because we know that silver is probably the most popular topic on the channel. Peter, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me, Rob. It's certainly a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to meet you. I know in the gold silver space, we like to think of it as a small, close-knit community of people, but I keep running into new people on an everyday basis that follow the industry, which is nice to see. It's nice to see that we have a lot of support. I know that you've been following it for a long time. Just to introduce you and a little bit of your background to our audience before we get started talking about the book. I know that you're formerly a portfolio advisor. What led you into gold and silver? Were you aware of those as a portfolio advisor, or was that like a transition for you into the precious metals?
It was somewhat of a transition while I was doing that line of work. In fact, it's a little bit of an interesting story or anecdote to that is that it was sort of more on the mutual fund side. And then I was aware of the Millennium Bullion Fund run out of Canada. And that being listed as a mutual fund and normally should be investable by the wider public. I looked into that, and there were all sorts of restrictions, limitations, and when I telling some of the people that should list the funds and make it available, I said, this would be great for clients, for investors, and they said, oh, too risky, too concentrated. And I remember thinking, this is ridiculous. People can choose allocations. They can make small allocations to something that is very specific. And there's no reason why they shouldn't have exposure to this. And that sort of triggered a lot of questions in my mind about how precious metals were limited in terms of investment options for the average investor. And that, I guess, sort of led me to looking more and more into the space. And some investment newsletters and I guess leading thinkers in the space really sort of got myself thinking a lot more about this. And it kind of started there.
Yeah, very interesting. So I know that you write for some newsletters. When did you actually start writing about the precious metal space?
So that would go back to 2007. I was working with a group out of Baltimore, 𝙭𝙄𝙀, a larger financial newsletter group called 𝙭𝙀𝙀, which has many branches, and actually was fortunate enough to, I think it was my first project for them, I actually got teamed up with 𝙒𝙂𝙁 to work on a resource book. When I say book, I mean sort of a more limited sized white paper sort of thing. And so, but it was a well-researched item on the resource space and some precious metals. And so that helped trigger things. And from there, within about a year or two, started a newsletter with one of their branches. And that lasted for 10 years. And then eventually I started doing some freelance work for mining companies. And then about late 2020, connected with Gwen Preston at Resource Maven. And we saw that there was an unanswered or unserved niche in the newsletter space that was, a newsletter dedicated to silver and silver investment. And so within months, we launched that, which was January last year. Very, very happy with the response. And a couple months later, so that'd be March of last year, I thought, we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's not that I'm not busy, but let's just say social time is very limited. And I thought, why let a pandemic go to waste? Why not take all this research and knowledge on silver and write a book about it? And that's what led to the Great Silver Bull.
Yeah, I want to show where people can get that. I know that you can get it on Amazon. It's right here, The Great Silver Bull by Peter Krauth. Peter, where else can they get it? Do you sell it through a website, or are there other alternative areas?
So it's all on Amazon. To know more and to keep informed about any sort of developments, followers can go to 𝙂𝙊𝙇𝙖𝙂.com. That's sort of a landing page I have for the book, but otherwise Amazon would be the place to go.
All right, we'll get that landing page loaded up. Let's do that right now so people can take a look at it. Tell us a little bit about the book itself. What exactly are you writing about, and what are your thoughts on silver? We'll get started just with the basics.
Sure. So, it's in 5 parts. The first part is a brief history of silver. Part 2 is why silver matters today. Part 3 is silver, the irreplaceable metal. Part 4 is why silver is unique and set to soar. And then finally, part 5 is investing in silver and my ultimate guide, I guess, for investing in silver. But really, in a more sort of simple way, it's in 2 parts. The first part is silver's role in it throughout history as a money and then eventually industrial metal, and how it's important economically to help preserve wealth and grow wealth. Then the second part gets to sort of the more practical side of the investments, what opportunity there is in silver, why it's very much undervalued, perhaps underappreciated, and the potential that it has. And you look at analogs like the 1970s and how silver is primed to go much, much higher than from its current price level. And then ultimately your silver investment options, everything from physical silver all the way to junior explorers, and how to build what I feel is an ideal investment portfolio. What the different mining companies or mining company options are in terms of risk and potential, and then eventually how to manage that portfolio, and eventually how to sell and when to sell your silver investments. So that's really sort of a nutshell overview of what the book is all about.
So I want to go to the punchline first here, and then we can talk a little bit more about the substance of the book. I talk with a lot of people on where silver could go. I made what may seem like an ill-fated call about 10 years ago on Seeking Alpha, that I thought, probably in my second or third article that I wrote there, that I thought silver could eventually reach the price of an ounce of gold. And my reasoning for that was it's much more rare. And I think over time, industrially going to be demanded more, but also it's a monetary substitute. I may amend that now to the fact that I don't think that the authorities on the derivative markets are going to allow it to trade that high, because silver is so needed for industrial use. They're either going to subsidize it or put price controls on the derivative markets before it ever got that high. Though, in my view, that does not reduce the importance of silver. I think it only reflects upon the importance of it that we have for it today in society. What is your view on what a price target could be for silver, given all of the demand and supply factors that you talk about in your book?
Yeah. So, my ultimate price target, these are things looking out obviously many years into the future. So with under some reservation, but I think silver could ultimately reach $300 an ounce. Okay. And in the book, I give multiple examples. And it's interesting to me, actually, that when I've done the research, I in different ways end up at that same price. So that's really the price that I'm comfortable with in terms of an ultimate high. One of them is the gold-silver ratio. And so if you look at what happened in 1980 when silver peaked at $50 and gold around 850, that was a 15-to-1 ratio. And then if you look at what happened in 2011 when this gold silver ratio bottomed at 30, I mean, I think that in a relatively conservative way, I feel that the ratio will ultimately eventually bottom at least at 30. I don't rule out for sure something lower, which would mean higher, more highly valued silver versus gold. But I think gold will, and again, I think conservatively reach at least $5,000. So if you do kind of a 30-to-1, that leads you to about the $300 silver. And so that's one way. I look at what silver did in the 1970s in terms of gains, but then I discount what's happened with inflation because I feel inflation is underrated, underreported. And so given that silver was up 37 times in the 1970s, that kind of gain would, again, with inflation, real inflation, lead to about $300 silver. If you look at things like the average home price in the U.S. Versus the silver price. So in 1980, it took about 1,500 ounces of silver to buy the average home. And if you do the math with current home price around just under, say, $500,000 U.S., at that ratio, you're looking at, in fact, about 1,500 silver ounces, you're looking at about $300 silver. So as I say, there really are multiple ways that you can get to a $300 silver price. And yeah, I mean, I make a point of detailing those to show people that I'm not just pulling that number out of thin air. I'm not trying to be sensational. It's what my research has really ultimately pointed towards.
And do you think, Peter, from a demand perspective, can you outline where the major demands for silver come and where you think over the next 5 to 10 years we could see increases?
Sorry, was that major demands?
Yeah, major demands for silver.
Okay. So I would say that, one of the main ones, so about half of silver, a little more than half, 54%, 55% is from the industrial side. So there's no question that industrial demand for silver is very important. And the single most important demand driver for silver is solar panels, which represent about 10 or 11% of all silver demand currently. And with the green revolution, the push towards decarbonization, governments really want to push things like solar, wind, electrification. And so I see the growth in silver panel production and use continuing to climb. That will keep a very solid floor under silver prices, along with things like medical applications. Silver certainly is very important in medicine as a biocide, and it's important in things like automotive applications, electronics, and all of these are things where there's lots of growth. So silver being relatively cheap and used in relatively small amounts in these applications means that even a considerably higher silver price is not a big deterrent to continuing to use silver. And it's really got some characteristics that cannot be equaled by other metals. I really explain actually in the book how it's irreplaceable in so many ways. And so when you look at how it's used in industry, it would be very difficult to find other metals to replace it. So I believe that industrial demand will provide a very solid floor, a rising floor under silver prices, and that the marginal demand from investment, which is certainly not to be discounted, especially when we look at what happened last year, late January, with the silver squeeze. Investment demand is again sort of underrated, underestimated. And I think that's going to really help provide a lot of leverage on the silver price and push it much, much higher. So that's really sort of my outlook.
In chapter 15, which is entitled The Secret Key Real Rates, explain what your thesis is for that chapter. Are we talking about real interest rates?
Yes, exactly. So I've provided actually two charts that look at real rates. So the sort of average interest rate minus the inflation rate over time. And if you chart that against the gold price, then you see a very clear inverse relationship. And that's what I feel is certainly the single best predictor of gold prices. It's interesting that if you look at a similar chart, which I haven't really seen anybody else do, but of real rates against the silver price, it's almost identical to the gold versus real rates chart. And so it's also a very good predictor of where silver prices are headed and likely to remain. So I probably not alone to think that we're in a long-term negative real rate environment. I've been saying that inflation is going to be the single most important defining feature of the investment landscape for the next at least probably the rest of this decade. And so with that in mind, and central bank central planner hands tied in terms of being able to realistically meaningfully raise rates, we're in a long-term negative real rate environment. And so that's going to be very bullish for silver.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's interesting that you mentioned that that's a similarity between silver and gold. And I've always recommended for people, at least what I do, is I keep a mix of silver and gold in my portfolio and at mining stocks as well. Chapter 19 is entitled Gold is Gold. I'm assuming there that you're talking about differences between gold and silver and how gold and silver should be viewed differently. So explain a little bit about the differences between the two metals.
Absolutely. So there's no question gold is the sort of big recognized player in the precious metals space. It gets all the attention. And it's the market. If you look at the annual supply of gold, it's about 10 times the size of silver. I think it's, if memory serves me right, about $270 billion, and silver is about $27 billion. And so on that basis, silver is a tenth the size of gold, the silver market. And so it's a much easier market to influence and to sway. Buying pressure certainly can push silver prices up much more quickly. And so on that basis, it's different from gold and has more leverage and is more volatile. Most of gold, about 90% of gold, is used in some way or another as some kind of a form of investment, whether that's, central bank ownership, whether that's in form of jewelry. You could argue that's a way of saving. It is certainly for many people in the world, in India, in China, it's very much a way of saving, stashing away savings. And in silver, it's a very different profile. We kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, where about half of silver goes to industrial applications. And then the rest is split amongst investment, amongst things like jewelry, silverware. And so it's a different investment profile from gold and a smaller market. And so because of those aspects, it's easier to kind of push the silver price around, and it's certainly subject to more volatility and certainly on the downside, but very much on the upside. And that's for many people part of its appeal.
I noticed in chapter 26, you're talking about key silver investment trends. You mentioned the central bank digital currencies. What is your view on central bank digital currencies? Do you think that they're going to be a replacement ultimately for the precious metals in the monetary system, or can they, coexist side by side?
I think, I don't know about coexisting. That may end up ultimately being the case. But I think that given how things are degrading quickly enough, I think what will likely happen is that, yes, central bank digital currencies will come in. And unfortunately, what they're likely to do is they will not be backed by anything of any value, anything more than reserve currencies are today. And so what they will do, because they're just that much easier to proliferate, print, so to speak, and distribute, they're going to accelerate, I think, some sort of a financial reset, because they're going to likely lead to more inflation, like perhaps even some sort of hyperinflation. And I think that'll just sort of bring a reset much more quickly. And I think that Precious metals will have a role to play for sure in that reset. People will look for an anchor, a credible anchor. And I think that there will be a place for precious metals, certainly gold and silver especially, that would back that would back cryptocurrencies. And that the advantages of cryptocurrencies certainly should not be discounted. I mean, what we would call frictionless or near frictionless transactions, very low cost, very quick transfers of value. And if people are looking for an anchor through precious metals, and you can have cryptocurrencies that are backed with trust by precious metals, then I could certainly see people gravitating towards that. And that would be, at least, perhaps it's a bit of a pie in the sky dream, but that would certainly be, in my mind, the ultimate kind of currency would be a precious metals backed cryptocurrency. That would certainly be the way to go.
So let's talk about the mining sector for just a moment. Certainly supply chains in the mining sector have come more into focus of the general public the last couple of years, I would say, due to some shortages we had around the time of the COVID pandemic. We have major international organizations now talking about potential for food shortages this year. So the supply chain definitely has been stretched. How important are the miners to the supply chain for gold and silver? And is that an investable space that you play around in and would recommend other people take a look at?
When you say that being an investable space, you mean the miners specifically?
The miners, yes.
Yeah. So they've been affected. There's no question. The supply chain issues have certainly wreaked perhaps some level of havoc, perhaps not necessarily dramatic, but it has slowed their access to supplies in some cases. It has made, perhaps access to energy, perhaps companies that use diesel for production. That's been difficult, or natural gas, in some cases, even electricity. So, but as far as, playing in the mining space, I think that that's a great way to leverage the potential of silver. And I certainly like to point out that I don't feel that people have to take outsized risk when it comes to investing in the mining space for silver. The options are vast. You have everything from physical silver, but then from there, in terms of risk, it starts at perhaps amongst the lowest risk are silver miner ETFs that are instant diversification across a group of silver miners. You have royalty companies. And then from there, you have large producers, and then mid-tiers being things like developers or producing or growing producers. And then it goes down the chain to junior explorers. And certainly those are the highest risk. But the volatility of the silver space, as far as I'm concerned, is not a reason to avoid silver. In fact, it should be part of its attraction. And in the book, I certainly talk about all kinds of ways that people can mitigate risk in terms of investing in silver and in silver stocks. And I provide 5 different ways that they can do that. One of the most obvious is to keep your allocations relatively small, especially in the higher risk plays like the junior miners, and to do things like take profits when you have considerable profits. Call that playing with the house's money. If your investment has doubled, over space of perhaps 12 months or 24 months, sell half, especially in a smaller play that is of higher risk. Take that money, either bank it or reallocate it to another investment option. And then you have things like trailing stops and rebalancing. But there are multiple ways that you can mitigate risk. And again, it shouldn't be a reason to avoid the space. If someone doesn't have the time or has a sort of a more limited or lower risk profile, they can easily stick to some of the larger plays or the mining ETFs. I mean, I give one example. I think it's between 2001 and 2008. Pan American silver, for example, was up almost 16 times. So that's today the world's second largest, if my numbers are right, the second largest public silver mining company. That's quite the return in a space of 7 years for a company of its size. And so that's a perfect example of, why investors should not avoid silver for volatility, but rather look to mitigate risk.
I agree with you there. I do think the junior mining space can be a great way to leverage the silver prices. You do, like you said, have to invest cautiously and carefully and make sure that you're investing in maybe more than one option in case that one option doesn't work for you. The book is about 54 chapters long by my recollection. So there's a lot of information in there. Peter, any other major points that you want to talk about real quickly before we close the interview?
Sure. Let's just mention, well, you do say 54 chapters, so I hope that doesn't scare anyone. What I do want to say is that the average chapter is actually very short, and I did that purposely. I felt that I would tackle individual topics very, in a detailed way, but split them up. And so it made them easier, and it also makes it easier, I think, to kind of find the different topics that that someone has read about and then maybe want to revisit afterwards. But one of the, I think, really important things is to consider how cheap silver is. I mean, silver is amongst major metals, both precious metals and base metals. It's the cheapest metal that there is you could invest in today. It's still 50%, more than 50% below its all-time high of 1980 and again of 2011. It's the only metal that is below its 1980 high. You look at all the base metals, the other platinum group metals, gold, really silver is very, very cheap. If you want something cheap today, there are not many cheap assets left. Silver is definitely something you want to look at. And I think something to keep in mind, too, is how silver has performed. And it gives us in the past, and it gives us really some indication of its potential going forward. So if you just look at the 1970s, silver was up 37 times. That's 3,700%. It dramatically outpaced gold. That was up 1,400%, 14 times. Silver always outperforms gold in bull markets. That's been shown many times in the last sort of 50 to 60 years. And the second thing is more recently, if you look at what happened during the pandemic, from about March, the low of March to the peak in August, that's about 5 or 6 months or so, in the spring, summer of 2020, gold was up 38%, but silver was up 152%. So it outperformed gold 4 times. So that, again, that certainly speaks to its volatility, but again, it speaks to its potential. Big leverage on the upside. And so the potential is huge. It's definitely a space people want to look at, not to mention, the wealth preservation aspect of it. That it's proven throughout history for millennia. Silver is something everybody needs in their portfolios. They just need to decide to what extent and in what form, but they definitely need exposure to silver.
All right. So we're talking about the book, The Great Silver Bull, Crush Inflation and Profit as the Dollar Dies by Peter Krauth. Peter, thank you so much for joining the program. We appreciate having you on today. It was an excellent interview, and I know people are going to love this because we have tons of silver lovers in our audience, probably the most vocal part of our audience. How do people, if they want to reach out to you about some of the newsletters you write or for more information, how do they go about reaching you?
Okay, so, well, thanks for that. So for the book itself, it's available on Amazon as of May 3rd, paperback or ebook. That's easy to find. Just search for The Great Silver Bull. And so on Amazon, and then there is a website for the book at thegreatsilverbull.com. And my newsletter, The Silver Stock Investor, is silverstockinvestor.com. So all very easy to find. You'll get to know a lot more about the newsletter, and certainly I invite everyone to follow both sites and the progress.
Thank you so much, Peter. We appreciate it. We'll have you back on, and thank you for writing the book. I know from having written a book, it's a big exercise to do it and get it out, but I know it's going to benefit investors, and especially anything silver focused. So thank you so much for joining the program.
It's been been a real pleasure, Rob. I appreciate that very much.
Mm-hmm.